Beside the Brook, the story of someone who found the truth, written by McDonald. Beside the Brook, Chapter 10, The Pheasant Nursery. Mr. Jupe was a very busy man in the spring and summer months, for the woods were peopled with dozens of infant partridges and pheasants, whose lives it was his duty to guard. He used to bribe with a shilling any child who discovered a nest, but how anyone had the courage to point one out in a place where one was not supposed to go was a marvel. Perhaps the prospect of the shilling induced the bravery. Anyway, Mr. Jupe took all the eggs into his big pockets and placed them under every broody hen he managed to borrow, because mother pheasants are easily frightened into deserting their nests. Next, the gamekeeper chose a field as pheasant nursery, dotting hen coops about it, and moved his own headquarters into a corner of it near the brook. Behind stockades padded with furze or heather, he would sit by the hour waiting for robbers, his ears cocked as well as his gun. A scream in the trees told him of the jay, and from that moment the bird's hours were numbered. A squirrel, scolding and stamping in the trees, betrayed the weasel running snake-like along the bough. A form hovering high in the blue proved itself to be a kestrel hawk by its sudden dash to earth, and Mr. Jupe's own nose told him when a fox was near. Cats, too, were his target. He would have slain the pet of his own family had he found it in the nursery. The two black retrievers were as keen as their master, waiting by his side for the gun to speak. Away they would race before the smoke of the bang had cleared, returning with the limp thief to lay at his feet. The keeper's vigilance increased with the appearance of the pheasant babies, who were not so sensible as the hen's own chicks. Instead of running to their foster mother for cover from the rushing shadow, these babies crouched and froze, relying on their brown and yellow streaks for camouflage. Some escaped thus, but the eye of a practised robber was not easily deceived, so that it behoved Mr. Jupe to come to the rescue. Fir boughs were placed by each coop for shelter and roosting, and regularly the babies were fed with careful mixtures from Mr. Jupe's larder. They ought to thrive, but alas, woe was their lot. Only a few would live to see another spring. Most would find their way to a poulterer's shop before the holly berries turned red. Up to the brook to the nursery the 4 young ducks passed in procession every summer morning. Mr. Jupe took no notice of them other than watching out of the corner of his eye to see that they did not touch the pheasant's food in passing, and the ducks took no notice of him other than to acknowledge his presence with a courteous quack, quack. Whether the ducks brought ideas back to Ginger, or the wind puffed enticing whiffs along the brook towards him, is not certain, but the cat took to following them a little further every day. The first day he stopped at a rabbit hole and sniffed a while before coming back. The next day he surprised himself, as well as a leveret that jumped from beneath his feet, and the third day he crept into a nursery. The ducks returned that night to their home, but Ginger did not. It was the first time he had failed to be present at tea-time, so that Teddy went round the farmyard, in the wood, and to the field beyond, calling, "Puss, puss." "Maybe he has followed the children," he thought, "and they will bring him back before night." But no one brought Ginger, and Teddy grew uneasy, for one misses even a cat when one lives alone. Frequently during the day his thoughts roamed to his lost pet. He remembered to leave food for him, but the ducks finished that before setting out for the day. No Ginger appeared in the evening, but John arrived with a basket of new potatoes and mint. "Is Ginger spending a holiday with you, laddie?" he asked. "He hasn't been here since yesterday morning." "No, Teddy," replied John. "We haven't seen him at all. Wherever can he be?" "I hope he'll turn up," said the old man. His voice did not betray uneasiness, but he had a fear that Ginger's hunting instincts had got him into trouble. "Peggy and I will look for him," declared John. "We must find Ginger." The children looked everywhere for the cat they loved as much as if he had been their own. They searched the queer places in the timber yard, hung around the dairy, and even went some distance along the high road, but failed to find him. To the woods, however, they did not go, for this was the time of the year when Mr. Jupe was most difficult. Mrs. Broom had a shrewd idea about Ginger's fate, for a similar one had befallen two of her cats in early summer. Now she refused to keep one, for Peggy had grieved bitterly over the loss of the second. John had been too young to remember. Teddy, however, forgot Ginger for the time being in dealing with another worry. Returning from work, he could hear the ducks quacking loudly. It was not the ordinary quack of content or impatience, but a distressed quack, 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 followed by a short pause and another outburst. "There's something amiss," he said, and when he rounded the drove bend he saw only 3 ducks stretching their necks up the steps of the shieling. Seeing him, they set off towards him, waddling hurriedly in line, quacking the while. "Now what's happened?" he said to them. And the ducks looked as if all ready to show him, for they turned round and waddled home in front. "It's Hazel that's missing," observed Teddy, "so we must find her." Only stopping to cast down his load and to quieten the birds with a hasty mash of meal and water, the shepherd set off up the brook, the direction that the ducks usually took. With a stick he beat down the nettles and clinging brambles that delayed his progress. He passed both palings that kept back the cattle, and stopped now and again to listen. If Hazel were alive, he would hear her before he saw her. Soon Mr. Jupe's hut appeared in sight, and that gentleman also sitting on a stool with his gun ready nearby, contemplating his family of young pheasants hopping about in their fir boughs. They were now big enough to be seen from a distance, and the keeper with sleeves rolled up and cap pulled down well over his eyes on account of the sun, was smoking a long pipe whose bowl nearly touched the cap. Well pleased with this season's prospect of young birds, he greeted the shepherd genially. "Evening, shepherd," he said. "What brings ye along this way?" "One of my ducks has not come back," said Teddy. "Have ye seen her?" "Oh, aye," replied Mr. Jupe. "They all went along this morning, as they allus do, but I never noticed them coming back. Come to think of it, that accounts for the row." "What row?" asked Teddy. "Quacking. They ducks ha' been hollering all arternoon up this way and down that way. Hark now." They listened. The sound of quacking could certainly be heard from the farm and the direction of the shieling, but in addition a single cry rose faintly and piteously at intervals from higher up the brook. Mr. Jupe's quick ear decided the matter. "That be your duck, depend upon it," he said with finality, "and I be glad that 'twant a fox as had her." Teddy waited no longer, but hurried further up the brook, and as he went Hazel's distress cry grew louder. A couple of meadows beyond the keeper's hut, the brook flowed through a dark copse, and in the shadows cast by the trees upon the water, he detected a fluttering and beating that seemed to be mixed up with a tangle of sticks in midstream. The quacking stopped a while, for the duck was exhausted with her struggling. Hurriedly the shepherd drew near, and seeing him, Hazel began tugging and crying afresh. A small coil of rusty barbed wire attached to a broken post and caught in a swirl of dead sticks held Hazel fast by the wing and leg. With her free limb she was paddling frantically and beating her wings on the water. The more she strove to get loose, the more tangled she became. A fallen bough happened to be lying near, so Teddy pushed it into the brook and descended to disentangle the victim. Very gently he held her body with his left hand, while with the right he pressed back the cruel barbs that had already torn her flesh and scattered her feathers. It was no easy task, for the wire sometimes sprang back on his own arm, but he took no notice. At last Hazel was free. Teddy climbed to the bank where he examined her. She tried to stand, but flopped. Her wing hung down and her leg was lame. But there was happiness in her eye now that her master had found her. Tucked safely in his jacket with her head poking out and supported by the curve of his arm, Hazel was borne home along the brookside. "Found her, then," observed Mr. Jupe as they approached. "What's matter?" "She got caught in some barbed wire in the brook," replied the shepherd. "She must have been there some time, judging from the state she's in. But I'll get her right." "Give her some hot mash," counselled Mr. Jupe, "and rub some oil in her feathers. Here," he said in a burst of generosity, "or I'll give 'ee a little maize for her." And from the smelly inside of his larder he produced a paper bag of grain, which he presented to Teddy with a wink. "That's very good of you, Mr. Jupe." "Thank you," said the old man. "She ought to get better with one thing and another." Their arrival home was hailed with delight by the other ducks. Gathering round, they watched their master fetch a wooden box and line it with sack and dead grass, while Hazel waited inside the hut on the mat. At intervals they quacked, and so often got in the way that at last Teddy herded them into their pen and shut them up earlier than usual. Hazel enjoyed her hot mash and a little maize, after which she settled comfortably in the box which Teddy placed inside the hut. Then he prepared his belated meal, and his thoughts turned to Ginger. He shook his head. "He's been gone for days noo. He'll no come back after this." Peggy and John ran to the shieling just before dark. "Has Ginger come back?" they asked. "No," replied their friend. "I'm afraid he's gone for good." "Oh," said Peggy, her face dropping. "I won't believe it." "But we really have looked everywhere," said John. "We're so sorry, Teddy. It's a good thing you have the ducks for company." Then Teddy told them about Hazel, and being invited in to see the invalid, they forgot the cat. "What will you do with her when you go to work?" asked Peggy. "I'm sure Mother would look after her." "Maybe I'll put her box in the pen," said Teddy. "I'll not trouble your mother." "Peggy," said John on the way home, "there's one place where we haven't looked for Ginger." His sister did not say, "Where's that?" for she knew. John was only breaking the news that he intended braving Mr. Jupe's anger by going into the big cover. "You mean the wood?" she asked. "All right, John. Tomorrow night after tea. It's too late to go now."